is 100% fiction. All elements are imaginary. Coincidences with reality are accidental. But 18. Entertainment only. There was an unofficial joke among the men of the Marcello family. They said that Pietro, the heir, the untouchable, the man who made other dangerous men look away, had been brought down by a 24-year-old redhead from Boston who wore a white coat, carried a notepad instead of a weapon, and had the irritating ability to look directly at him as if she could read every thought he had decided not to express. They said it quietly, of course, and never near Pietro, but they said it. They had met at a hospital, not in the romanticized way movies like to portray. No flowers, no golden light, no meaningful glances set against soft background music. It was an emergency hallway at 2 a.m, one of Pietro's men with a knife in his abdomen, and Diana Carvalho, a psychiatry resident who had come down to the ER floor to cover for a colleague, standing in the middle of the chaos with her notepad in hand and an expression Pietro had taken exactly 3 seconds to catalog. It wasn't fear. It was assessment. She was evaluating the situation, evaluating the men who had arrived with the injured, evaluating Pietro specifically, with those green eyes that didn't have the decency to pretend they weren't doing exactly what they were doing. "Are you family?" she had asked. Direct. No preamble. "I'm responsible for him." "Then I need you to tell me if he has any medication allergies I should know about before." "Pietro," he had corrected. She had blinked. "Excuse me?" "Not sir. Pietro." Diana had looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an equation that had returned an unexpected result. Then she had turned her notepad and written Pietro in handwriting he would later discover was completely illegible to anyone but her. "Pietro, any known drug allergies on your guy?" It wasn't the way people generally spoke to him. In fact, it was the exact opposite of how people generally spoke to him. And Pietro Marcello, who had developed over 30 years a considerable resistance to almost everything, had discovered in that hallway at 2 a.m. that he was completely unprepared for someone who simply had no interest in treating him like Pietro Marcello. To her, in that moment, he was just the man responsible for the patient. He had stayed at the hospital until 4 a.m, technically because of his man. In practice, because Diana had come back to the hallway 3 times with updates on the patient's condition, and each time she appeared, Pietro found he had one more question to ask. About the procedure, the prognosis, anything that justified 30 more seconds of conversation with someone who held eye contact without flinching and answered questions with the precision of a scalpel. The 4th time she appeared, he had asked for her number. Diana had paused, had looked at him with that evaluating expression he was already learning to recognize, and had said with admirable calm, "You know I know who you are, right?" "I know." "And you're still asking for my number?" "Yes." Another pause. Then she had written, in that impossible handwriting, a phone number, torn the page out and handed it to him without ceremony. "If I don't answer, I'm on shift. Text me." Pietro had looked at the piece of paper. Then, at her. "You're not going to ask what I do?" "I already know what you do," said Diana, already turning to leave. "The interesting question is what you are." "That I don't know yet." She had disappeared down the hallway before he could respond. Pietro had stood there holding a piece of paper with a phone number written in illegible handwriting, then had folded it carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, in the same place he normally kept things he couldn't afford to lose. They had dated for 8 months. 8 months that had included 3 high-intensity arguments about incompatible work schedules, one occasion where Diana arrived 2 hours late to an important dinner and refused to apologize because "I was in the middle of a session and you knew I was a psychiatrist when you invited me." One night where Pietro had shown up at her clinic at 11 p.m. with Thai food because she had texted saying she was working late and he had decided, without being invited without warning, that this was unacceptable, and Diana had been so irritated by the intrusion that she had gone completely silent for 10 minutes and then eaten 2/3 of the food. They had also included the first time she had slept at his penthouse and woken up at 6 a.m, making notes in a pad by the morning light, while Pietro watched from the other side of the bed with the strange and mildly unsettling feeling that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The time he had arrived at one of the family's mandatory events with Diana at his side, and his sister Francesca had looked at the green-eyed redhead who was surveying the room with a clinical expression and whispered to Pietro, "Either she runs this marriage or you do, and I already know which one," to which Pietro had responded with a look that should have been intimidating, and which Francesca had ignored entirely. And they had included the night Diana, sitting on the penthouse terrace holding a cup of herbal tea she insisted on calling medicinal, and Pietro insisted on calling kindergarten tea, had looked at him and said, with no preamble, no dramatic build-up, "I think you should know that I'm in love with you. It doesn't change what you do or who you are, but it seems relevant to mention." Pietro had looked at her. "You could have built up to that more," he had said eventually. "I could have. But you know my communication style. Straight to the point." "Straight to the point," she had confirmed, as if they were discussing a diagnosis. He had been quiet for a moment, then had set down his coffee cup, because he drank coffee at 11 at night like a man who had given up on having a healthy relationship with sleep, and had said with the same absence of drama, "Since the hospital hallway." Diana had blinked. "What?" "Me. Since the hospital hallway." A pause. "You asked if my man had any drug allergies, and I stayed until 4 in the morning in a place I had no reason to be. That should have been obvious enough." She had been quiet for a moment that Pietro had spent trying not to pay too much attention to her expression. Then Diana had picked up her cup again, taken a long sip, and said, "For a man who runs an entire criminal organization, you are terrible at verbal communication. And you're the psychiatrist in the relationship." "Exactly. So you should have told me sooner." Pietro had started to say something and she had smiled, that specific rare smile she reserved for moments that caught her off guard. And he had stopped mid-sentence because he had learned, over the previous 8 months, that there were things for which no adequate response existed when Diana Carvalho smiled that way. They had married 6 months later. Small wedding. By the nature of his work. By her preference. Diana had worn a dress that Francesca had considered too simple, and Pietro had considered perfect because it matched the way she did everything, without excess, without performance, with a clarity that required no ornament. And because, with her red hair loose and her green eyes fixed on him in front of the officiant, she had looked exactly like what she was. The only person who had ever looked at him and wanted to know what he was, not just what he did. That Pietro had decided that day was worth more than anything he had ever built before. Now it was Tuesday, 2:37 p.m. And the secondary phone had vibrated 3 times in Pietro's pocket during a meeting he himself had called in the downtown Chicago offices, 22 men around a mahogany table, when the screen lit up with a blocked number. He raised one hand. The room went silent. "Pietro." The voice on the other end was male, calm, almost bored. "Your wife is with us. The baby too. They're fine for now. Don't call the police. You know what happens when someone does that." The call ended. 11 seconds. Pietro stared at the phone for a moment that felt like the equivalent of a geological era. Then, with no apparent urgency, raised his eyes to the room. Everyone out. Nobody asked why. Nobody made a comment. The room cleared in under 40 seconds. When the door closed, Pietro stood alone for exactly 3 breaths. Then he turned the table over. Diana Marcello née Carvalho had developed over 6 years of medicine and 2 years of psychiatric residency, a skill she considered her most valuable asset. She could assess a crisis situation in under 30 seconds. 30 seconds to read the environment. 30 seconds to catalog the exits. 30 seconds to decide whether the best strategy was to speak or stay silent. The problem was that none of her supervisors had ever included abducted at 7 months pregnant in a warehouse, smelling of diesel and rusted metal, on the list of possible clinical scenarios. Diana was sitting in a metal chair, not restrained, which she registered as relevant information, with her hands resting on the considerable weight of her belly. The baby was awake. She could feel the regular kicks against the right side of her ribs, that specific rhythm her son used when the environment shifted around him. He feels the stress, she thought. He inherited that from his father. There were 3 men in the room, one by the door, 2 about 20 feet away, speaking in low voices in a dialect she identified as Sicilian, not fluent enough to translate everything, but familiar enough to catch fragments. Wait. Message sent. Don't touch her. The third thing Diana had learned in 6 years of medicine was that people in acute states of fear made terrible decisions when they believed they had no options. And the most important thing a doctor could do was convince them, with absolute calm, with logic, with presence, that options existed. She breathed in slowly, dropped her shoulders, released the tension in her jaw. The man by the door noticed. "You don't have to pretend you're okay," he said. "You're allowed to be scared." "Thank you for the permission," she replied, in a tone that sounded absurdly close to the one she used for thanks for the referral with clinic colleagues. "I'd rather not, though. Do you have water?" The man stared at her. "Seriously?" "I'm 32 weeks pregnant and I've been placed in a low-humidity environment," Diana explained with the patience of someone who had explained the same thing 10 times to a patient's family member. "Dehydration in the 3rd trimester can trigger premature contractions. Believe me, none of you want to manage active labor in here. I have no intention of making anyone's life easier today." There was a pause. The man by the door exchanged a look with the 2 in the back. 30 seconds later, she had a water bottle. First test, thought Diana. They need me to stay well. Pietro was out of the conference room with the phone already in his hand. His security detail materialized at his flanks as if summoned by telepathy, which in a sense they had been. They knew him well enough to understand that this particular walk was not a walk. "Diana's been taken," Pietro said without stopping, without looking at either of them. "I need everything the security cameras on Michigan Avenue recorded from noon onward." 5 minutes. They disappeared. Pietro descended the stairwell alone, which was exactly how he preferred it, because when the cold settled in the center of his chest like this, the presence of other people functioned as noise, and he needed silence to think. Diana had left the clinic at 11:40. He knew the time because she had texted him, a photo of a snack she had bought from the bakery on the corner, accompanied by the note. "The baby demanded a chocolate croissant. I agreed with him." Pietro had responded with an eye-roll emoji that she had returned with 3 exclamation points. That had been the last message. Someone had monitored her routine, which meant planning, which meant time, which meant someone had been paying attention for days or weeks, without any of his security systems catching a single signal. In 18 years operating in this world, Pietro had learned there were 2 kinds of dangerous enemy. The one you knew too well, and the one you didn't know yet. The second was invariably more lethal. No mapped patterns, no tested weaknesses, no established limits. And that call didn't sound like any family he knew. The protocol, the calm, the 11-second brevity, no immediate demand, no deadline, no figure. Just, she's with us and you know what happens. It was the language of someone who had done this before and understood that silence was more unsettling than any explicit threat. Pietro pushed through the stairwell door and kept moving. There was one variable those people had calculated wrong. They had taken Diana Marcello, which meant they knew who the husband was, which meant they assumed they knew what Pietro Marcello was capable of when he had something to lose. The problem was that until this moment there had never been something he couldn't afford to lose. Back in the warehouse, Diana had negotiated 2 water bottles, a chair with proper back support, and, after a conversation, she would later describe to Pietro as essentially cognitive behavioral therapy applied to career criminals. A blanket. The man by the door was visibly uncomfortable with the situation, which she filed as useful data. "Do you always do that?" he asked eventually. "Stay this calm?" "I'm a psychiatrist," said Diana, adjusting the blanket over her knees. "High-tension situations are part of the job. Kidnapping isn't part of a psychiatrist's job. You'd be surprised." A pause. "But no. This one's new." He looked at her for a long moment. You're not scared? Diana considered the question honestly, the way she always considered questions because she had learned early that dishonest answers were useless, to the patient, to the doctor, to anyone involved. She was scared. A cold, precise fear located exactly in the center of her sternum, the kind that didn't paralyze but sharpened, that made you see more clearly, think faster, register every detail of the environment as if the volume of the world had been turned up 2 degrees. But above the fear was something else, a quiet, absolute certainty that she couldn't explain to someone who didn't know Pietro Marcello the way she knew him, who hadn't seen what was underneath what he did. "My husband is going to find me," she said simply. The man didn't answer. "Not because of what he is," Diana continued, with the same clinical calm she used to deliver a diagnosis, "but because he will find me. It's what he does." A pause. "So the real question you should be asking isn't what happens to me. It's what happens to you when he gets here." The silence that followed was the specific kind she had learned to recognize in hospital rooms. The silence of someone hearing a truth they didn't want to hear. The baby kicked twice, hard. Diana placed her hand on her belly. "I know," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "He's not going to like this either." At 3:02 p.m., Pietro was in front of a security camera feed. At 3:09 p.m., he had identified the vehicle. At 3:14 p.m., he had the make, a partial plate, the direction it had gone. At 3:15 p.m., he was in the car. He hadn't spoken about what he felt. There was no need. What he felt was a simple, absolute thing that required no words, only direction and speed. Diana was somewhere in this city. The baby was with her. And Pietro Marcello had learned over 30 years of existence that there were things he could walk away from. Losses he had calculated and accepted as part of the cost of being what he was. Diana had never been one of them. Since the hospital hallway. Everything else was detail. Nico Marcello had seen his cousin do a lot of things over the course of 28 years. He had seen Pietro negotiate with men twice his age when he was 16, and already carried himself like someone who had never needed permission for anything. He had seen him walk into rooms where people wanted him dead and leave those rooms without adjusting his tie. He had seen him absorb news that would have broken most men, the death of his father, the collapse of a key alliance, the kinds of losses that left marks, and process it all with that particular brand of stillness that people who didn't know him mistook for coldness. What Nico had never seen in 28 years was Pietro Marcello make a mistake born out of emotion. Until now. "You're going too fast," Nico said from the passenger seat, his voice carefully neutral. "I know. If you get pulled over, I won't." "Pietro." "Nico." The single word landed with enough weight to close the conversation entirely. Nico closed his mouth. Looked out the window at Chicago sliding past at a speed that was aggressively inadvisable for a Tuesday afternoon. Then looked back at Pietro, jaw set, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road with a focus that was almost surgical, and made a quiet internal decision to say nothing further about the speed. Instead, Rafferty called back. "And? He says it's not the Donatello family." He sounded genuine. A pause. "For what that's worth." From Rafferty, "It's worth something." Pietro's eyes didn't leave the road. "Which means we're back to the unknown variable. There's something else." Nico pulled up his phone. The partial plate came back with 3 possible vehicles registered in the greater Chicago area. 2 we eliminated, wrong model. The third is registered to a shell company. Delaware Incorporation. No traceable owner. Pietro said nothing, but his hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "The shell company was incorporated 14 months ago," Nico continued, "which means whoever this is, they've been building this for over a year." The car was quiet for a moment. "They planned around the pregnancy," Pietro said. It wasn't a question. Nico understood that immediately, understood the specific quality of the silence that followed it. The way Pietro's voice had gone flat in a register that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the kind of controlled fury that was exponentially more dangerous than the visible kind. "That's what it looks like," Nico said carefully. 14 months. Pietro ran the math without meaning to. Diana had told him she was pregnant 13 months ago on a Wednesday morning, with the same directness she brought to everything. Sitting across from him at the kitchen counter with a coffee cup in her hands and the test on the marble between them, watching him with those green eyes that were doing that thing where they tracked his reaction like she was reading a clinical chart. He had looked at the test, then at her. Then he had picked up his coffee, taken a slow sip, and said, "You've known for how long?" 3 days. She had tilted her head. "I wanted to be sure before I introduced new variables into your operational stress levels." Pietro had put down the coffee. "My operational stress levels. You run a criminal enterprise, Pietro. You have a lot going on." "Diana." "Yes? Come here." She had come around the counter without ceremony, and he had pulled her in with both arms in the specific way he never did in front of anyone else, without calculation, without the managed distance he kept between himself and every other person on earth. And she had let him, which was its own kind of answer. Someone had been watching them for 14 months. Someone had known before his son was even the size of a closed fist. Pietro accelerated. The warehouse was in the south side. Diana had figured that out 20 minutes in, not from anything the men said, but from the sound profile of the environment. Distant freight trains at specific intervals, a particular quality of wind off the lake, the muffled rhythm of industrial machinery 3 or 4 blocks east. She had grown up in Boston, trained in New York, and moved to Chicago for Pietro. She knew this city now the way she knew her patients, not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to read the signals it sent when it thought no one was paying attention. South Side Warehouse District, probably within half a mile of the rail yard. She filed the information and kept her face neutral. The man by the door, she had graduated him from Door to Luca in her mind, based on a name she'd caught in a fragment of conversation, had stopped trying to unsettle her approximately 40 minutes ago, which she considered a minor victory. The 2 men in the back were a different calculation. One was older, maybe 50, with the specific posture of someone who had spent decades doing exactly this kind of work and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. The other was young, mid-20s maybe, and had not looked directly at her belly once, which Diana had catalogued as significant. Either he had a conscience that made the situation uncomfortable, or he had someone at home in a similar condition. Either way, he was the softer variable. She shifted in the chair. The baby shifted with her, a long, rolling movement that meant he was repositioning, not distressed. She knew his patterns with the intimacy of someone who had spent 7 months paying close clinical attention to every signal her own body sent. "He's okay," she thought. "We're okay." The thought arrived with a steadiness that surprised even her. Not bravado, not denial. Just the clean, functional assessment of a doctor who had learned to separate what she felt from what she knew. What she felt. The cold precision of fear. The specific ache of missing Pietro with an intensity that was almost embarrassing, given that she would never in her life admit to him exactly how loudly his absence registered. What she knew. She was unharmed. The baby was stable. The men in this room had been given explicit instructions not to touch her, and her husband was, at this precise moment, doing what Pietro Marcello did when something mattered enough to override every other operational priority. Taking the city apart until he found her. The young man in the back stood suddenly, said something low to the older one, then crossed the warehouse floor and stopped about 8 feet from Diana. He didn't look at her directly, looked at a point slightly to her left, which she recognized as the body language of someone who was about to say something they'd been rehearsing. "The doctor said to ask," he said in English that had a slight Chicago accent under a layer of something else, "if you need anything. For the—" He gestured vaguely in the direction of her belly with the energy of a man who had never been in the same room as a pregnant woman and was finding it deeply alarming. "Situation." Diana looked at him for a moment. "Tell the doctor I need to know the approximate timeline," She kept her voice even. Third trimester stress responses are cumulative. The longer this goes, the more variables I'm managing. The young man blinked. I don't think he meant... I know what he meant. She met his eyes calmly. But I'm a psychiatrist. If you want me to stay manageable, you need to give me information. Uncertainty is more destabilizing than bad news. A pause. That's not a threat. It's clinical fact. He stared at her for 3 full seconds, then turned and went back to the older man. Diana watched the exchange without appearing to watch it. Caught 2 words in the subsequent low conversation. She's different. Yeah. She allowed herself, privately, one very small moment of satisfaction, then put it away and went back to cataloging exits. Pietro got the location at 4:18 p.m., not from a trace, not from the cameras. From a 19-year-old runner who worked the Southside docks and owed the Marcello family a debt of the kind that didn't expire, whose older brother was alive and employed because of a decision Pietro had made 3 years ago that had cost him a significant alliance and which he had never once mentioned to the brother in question. The runner had seen the vehicle, had seen which building it went into, had written down the address on the back of a receipt and handed it to one of Pietro's men outside a bodega on Halsted Street without being asked, because in this city, certain people understood certain things about certain debts. Pietro looked at the address for approximately 4 seconds, then looked at Nico. How many men can you have there in 20 minutes? 8. 12 if I pull from the north side. Pull from the north side. A pause. Tell them no gunfire inside the building until I know exactly where she is. Nico was already on the phone. Pietro looked at the address again. Southside Warehouse District. Less than 2 miles from where they were sitting. Diana had been 40 minutes away from him this entire time. Had been 40 minutes away while he worked through camera feeds and shell companies and Delaware incorporations, and the knowledge of that sat somewhere behind his sternum with a specific weight he would not examine until she was back in front of him. Pietro. Nico lowered the phone. There's something else. The runner said he counted at least 6 men going in. Maybe more. Okay. That's a significant number for a containment operation. I know. Which means they're not just holding her. They're prepared for you to come. Pietro started the car. Then they prepared correctly, he said. Let's not disappoint them. The man who walked into the warehouse at 4:47 p.m. was not anyone Diana had seen before. He was in his 50s, well-dressed in the specific way that communicated money without advertising it. Dark coat, no jewelry, shoes that had been polished recently and deliberately. His hair was silver at the temples. His face was the kind that had once been handsome and had aged into something more useful than handsome, authoritative, unreadable, the face of someone who had spent decades deciding things and had learned that expressions were a resource to be managed. He walked in like he owned the building, which Diana immediately concluded he probably did. The 3 men straightened almost imperceptibly as he entered. Not the dramatic attention to detail of soldiers, something subtler, a slight reorientation of bodies toward a gravitational center. The young one near the back moved 2 steps to the left without seeming to realize he'd done it. He's in charge, Diana noted, and they've been waiting for him. The man stopped approximately 10 feet from her, looked at her with an assessment that was professional rather than threatening, cataloging, not intimidating, and then did something none of the others had done. He pulled up a chair and sat down. Eye level, deliberate choice. Diana recognized the technique. She used it herself in intake sessions with patients who needed to feel the power differential reduce before they could speak honestly. The gesture was designed to communicate. I am not here to frighten you. I am here to talk. She kept her face neutral and waited. Dr. Marcello, he said. His English was American, Midwest flat, no detectable accent. I apologize for the conditions. This wasn't the arrangement I would have preferred. What arrangement would you have preferred? She asked. A slight pause. He hadn't expected the immediate response. A conversation. You could have called the clinic. I needed your husband's attention, not yours. You have it, said Diana. Pietro's attention is not a difficult thing to acquire when it involves me. You could have accomplished that with a letter. The man studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. She tilted her head slightly. What did you expect? Fear. Or performance. Most people in your position choose one or the other. I'm a psychiatrist. I recognize both as counterproductive in a situation where the other party controls the environmental variables. A pause. So, what do you actually want? Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not warmth, something more precise. The recognition of a specific kind of opponent. My name is Doyle, he said. Russell Doyle. Your husband knows the name. Diana didn't confirm or deny, she filed it. I have a proposal for the Marcello family. Pietro has declined to hear it through the appropriate channels for the past 8 months. Doyle's voice remained even, conversational, as if they were discussing a business dispute over lunch. I needed him to understand that declining is no longer an option. So you used his pregnant wife as a memo. I used his pregnant wife as a guarantee. He corrected without apology. There's a difference. Functionally, from where I'm sitting, there isn't. Doyle almost smiled. No, I suppose not. Diana shifted her weight and looked at him with the clinical directness that Pietro said made most people feel like they were being x-rayed. Mr. Doyle, I'm going to tell you something as a professional courtesy, because I think you're an intelligent man and intelligent men benefit from accurate information. She kept her voice even. Whatever you think you know about Pietro Marcello, whatever calculation you made about how he would respond to this situation, you made it based on incomplete data. I've been studying the Marcello family for 14 months, Dr. Marcello. You've been studying what Pietro does. You don't know what he is. She held his gaze. Those are different things. I spent 8 months figuring out the difference, and I had significantly more access than you did. The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous ones. Doyle looked at her with an expression that had gone from professional assessment to something more careful, more considered. And what is he? He asked quietly. Diana looked at him for a long moment. He's someone who does not have a threshold for this particular situation, she said. Every negotiation has a threshold, a point where the rational actor calculates cost against outcome and adjusts. Pietro doesn't have one when it comes to me and this baby. A pause. That's not a threat. It's a clinical assessment of behavioral patterns, and it means that whatever you're planning to negotiate, you have significantly less time than you think. Doyle was quiet. In the back of the warehouse, the young man shifted his weight. You're trying to destabilize me, Doyle said finally. No, said Diana. I'm trying to save your life. There's a difference. I'm also a professional, mister. Doyle. And I took an oath about that a long time before I took a different kind of oath to Pietro. She settled back in her chair. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I can do that. It's called compartmentalization. Pietro's 12 men went in through 3 entry points at 5:02 p.m., 2 at the loading dock, 4 through the east side access. The remaining 6 held the perimeter with instructions Pietro had delivered in 11 words. Nobody leaves. Nobody calls out. Nobody makes a decision. Pietro went through the main entrance. Not because it was tactically optimal, because it sent a message that was more efficient than any alternative, that he had come through the front door of a building containing at least 6 armed men, in broad evening light without hesitation, and the message that sent was one that every person inside would understand without translation. Nico was 3 steps behind him. We have movement on the north side, one man trying to reach a vehicle. Handle it. Handled. The interior of the warehouse smelled like diesel and rust. The lighting was industrial, overhead fixtures that left pools of shadow between them. Pietro moved through it with the orientation of someone who had assessed the floor plan from the outside in under 4 minutes and mapped it against the sound profile Nico had pulled from the building records. He cleared the first corridor without incident. The second had 2 men. They made the specific calculation that most men made when they saw Pietro Marcello moving toward them with that particular quality of forward momentum, the calculation that discretion was the more survivable option, and stepped aside. Pietro didn't stop. The third corridor opened into the main warehouse floor, and that was where he heard it. Her voice. Not crying. Not scared. Talking. Steady. Precise. With that particular cadence she used when she was in a session and had located the exact frequency that would reach the person across from her. He couldn't make out the words yet, but he didn't need to. He knew that voice in every register it had. He had heard it at 2 in the morning when she was half asleep, and still managed to sound like she was taking notes. He had heard it across crowded rooms and through phone speakers, and once, memorably, from the other side of a bathroom door, when she had been arguing with a colleague on the phone, while also apparently reorganizing his medicine cabinet. He had never in his life been more grateful for it than he was in that specific moment. Pietro turned the corner. Diana saw him before Doyle did. She had been watching the corridor access point with her peripheral vision for the last 8 minutes. Not obviously, not in a way that would telegraph what she was doing, but with the careful, divided attention she had developed over years of monitoring entire group therapy rooms while appearing to focus on one person. Pietro came around the corner and she registered 3 things simultaneously, with the rapid clinical precision that had become reflexive after years of reading people for a living. First, he was uninjured. Second, the way he moved across that floor was different from any version of him she had seen in their 2 years together. Not faster, not louder, but compressed. Like something that had been held under significant pressure for several hours and was operating now with the absolute minimum of unnecessary movement. Third, he found her eyes before he found anyone else in the room. That last part was not tactically useful. She understood that. Pietro Marcello walking into a room containing a potential threat should have been assessing the threat first. He knew that. She knew that. And for approximately 2 seconds, neither of them did anything except hold the look, the specific private look that had no audience and required no translation, before he shifted his gaze to Doyle, and the quality of his expression changed entirely. "Mr. Doyle," Pietro said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. Diana had learned in 2 years that this was the most dangerous version of his voice, and from the way Doyle's posture adjusted fractionally, he understood that too. "Pietro," Doyle responded with the composure of someone who had prepared for this moment and was discovering that preparation had limits. "I'm going to take my wife now." Pietro stopped 3 feet from Diana's chair without looking away from Doyle. "And then you and I are going to have the conversation you apparently needed to use considerable resources to arrange." A pause. "Does that structure work for you?" Doyle looked at Diana. Something passed across his expression. Not guilt exactly, but the specific recalibration of someone who had entered a situation with one set of variables and exited with another. "Dr. Marcello," he said. "I meant what I said, about the conditions." Diana looked at him for a moment. "I know you did," she said. "That's actually what worries me most about you." She accepted Pietro's hand and stood. The baby shifted with the change in position, a long, slow movement that Pietro's hand, immediately on her lower back, registered before she could say anything. She watched him feel it, watched something happen in his expression that he controlled in approximately 1 second and which she filed away to address later. Privately, when they were somewhere that wasn't a South Side warehouse with 7 armed men and a man named Doyle watching them. "Can you walk?" Pietro said quietly. Just to her. "I've been sitting for 3 hours. I'd walk through a wall right now." Something almost imperceptible crossed his face. "Good. Don't." That was almost a joke. "Don't push it." She almost smiled. Didn't. Squeezed his hand once. Brief, unperformative, the same way she communicated most of the things she didn't say out loud, and felt him squeeze back with a pressure that said several things simultaneously, none of which required words. They walked toward the exit. At the corridor entrance, Diana paused and looked back at Doyle. Mr. Doyle, for what it's worth. Her voice was even. The proposal, whatever it is, lead with the actual numbers next time. Men like my husband respond to specificity, not to leverage. A pause. That's free. Considerate professional courtesy. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Your wife, he said to Pietro, with the tone of a man revising a significant calculation, is not what I expected. Pietro glanced at Diana. No, he said. She never is. The car ride back was quiet, not the comfortable quiet that had become one of their private languages over 2 years of marriage, the kind that settled between them on Sunday mornings or late evenings when words felt redundant. This was a different quality of silence. Denser. The kind that forms when two people have too many things to say and are each, for separate reasons, choosing not to say them yet. Diana sat in the back seat with Pietro's jacket over her shoulders because he had put it there before she could object, which was his specific method of doing things he knew she would argue about, moving faster than her resistance. She was warm. The baby had settled into a slower rhythm now, the particular calm that followed prolonged agitation, and she had one hand on her belly tracking it with the automatic attention she gave everything that required monitoring. Pietro sat beside her. Close. Not touching her, but close in the way that communicated he was aware of every inch of distance between them, and had chosen this specific measurement deliberately. She looked at him. He was looking out the window at Chicago, moving past in the early evening dark. His jaw was set. His hands were in his lap, still with the specific stillness of something that had been very recently in motion and had not yet fully decelerated. He hadn't said anything since the warehouse exit beyond 2 words to Nico about the perimeter and 1 quiet instruction to the driver about the route. Diana had counted. She counted things when she was assessing. It was automatic, reflexive, years of clinical habit she had long since stopped trying to turn off. You should eat something, Pietro said, without turning from the window. I'm fine. That's not what I said. She looked at him for a moment. I know what you said. He turned then. Looked at her with an expression that had several layers to it. She could see them the way she could see sediment in water, each one distinct if you knew what to look for. The surface layer was controlled, functional, the operational face he wore for the world. Underneath that was something tighter, something that had been compressed for the last several hours under significant pressure. And underneath that, visible only because she had spent 2 years learning to read him at exactly this depth, was something raw and unmanaged that Pietro Marcello almost never let reach his face. Diana, just her name, the way he said it when there was no performance in it. She reached over and put her hand over his. I know, she said quietly. You don't. I do. She kept her voice even, not clinical, just steady. I'm a psychiatrist, Pietro. I know what it looks like when someone has been operating on controlled adrenaline for 3 hours. I also know you're not going to tell me how that felt until you've had approximately 12 hours to decide exactly how much of it you're willing to say out loud. A pause. That's fine, I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the window. But his hand turned under hers and held it, which was Pietro, for you're right, and don't make me say it and thank you all at once. She knew the vocabulary. She had been learning it since a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, and she had become, she thought, reasonably fluent. The baby kicked once. Slow, firm, like a punctuation mark. Pietro felt it through their joined hands. She watched him register it. Watched the thing that happened in his face that he controlled in under a second. That private seismic shift that occurred every single time he felt the baby move, which had been happening for 5 months, and which he still hadn't fully learned to mask. She had never told him she noticed. Some things were better kept between a wife and her own private knowledge of her husband's tells. Doyle, she said after a moment. Later. Pietro. Later, Diana. Not sharp. Not dismissive. Just final in the way certain things between them were final, the door closing gently but completely on a conversation until he was ready to open it. First you eat. First, I see you with a doctor. I am a doctor. An OB, Diana, not yourself. She considered arguing, ran the cost-benefit analysis in approximately 3 seconds and concluded that the math didn't support it. Fine. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm doing it because the baby needs it, not because you asked. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Of course. The family physician, Dr. Renata Voss, 62 years old, 20 years working for the Marcello family with the discretion of someone who had long since made peace with the specific nature of her patient population, examined Diana at the penthouse with the efficient thoroughness of a woman who had seen most things and wasted no time on theatrics. Pietro stood in the doorway of the bedroom the entire time. Diana knew he was there without looking. She had become attuned to his specific quality of presence the way you became attuned to the weight of a familiar object. Automatically, without effort, registering it as naturally as room temperature. Dr. Voss checked blood pressure, fetal heart rate, ran her standard third trimester assessment with hands that were warm and practiced and entirely unhurried. Everything looks stable, she said finally, to Diana rather than Pietro, which Diana appreciated about her. Baby's heart rate is good. Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like, but not in concerning range. Stress response entirely predictable. She snapped her bag closed. You need water, a meal, and sleep, in that order. The sleep is non-negotiable. It never is with you, said Diana. Learn from it, doctor. Voss stood, looked briefly at Pietro in the doorway. That look that communicated an entire paragraph in 2 seconds. The specific look of a woman who had delivered similar information to this particular man before, and knew exactly what level of emphasis was required. She sleeps, Pietro. Real sleep. Not whatever you two call rest when there's something operational happening. Understood, he said. Good. She picked up her bag. Call me if anything changes. Anything at all. She left. Diana sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Pietro. You can come in now, she said. I've been in. You've been in the doorway. That's not the same thing. He came in, sat beside her on the edge of the bed with the careful deliberateness of someone managing the weight they were placing on a surface. Close. That same specific distance from before. Measured, chosen. Diana turned to look at him directly. Up close in the low evening light of their bedroom, without the operational context of the warehouse or the car, she could see all of it. The cost of the last several hours written in the specific way his face held itself when he was too tired to manage every layer simultaneously. The set of his jaw, the faint tension around his eyes that didn't reach his expression but was there if you knew where to find it. She put her hand on his face. He went still. Hey, she said quietly. He put his hand over hers, held it there, said nothing. We're both here, she said. Me and him. Both okay. Pietro closed his eyes. It lasted 3 seconds. 4. Then he opened them again and looked at her with that expression she had no clinical vocabulary for, the one that existed outside the reach of any framework she had ever studied, that she had only ever seen directed at her, that she suspected he was not entirely aware of when it was happening. I know, he said. Low. I know you are. But you needed to see it. Yes. She nodded, moved her hand from his face to his shoulder. Tell me about Doyle. A pause. The shift back into operational mode was visible, subtle, practiced, but visible to her. He's been building something for over a year, something that requires Marcello cooperation to function. He chose the wrong method of requesting it. He said you'd refuse to hear the proposal through appropriate channels. Pietro looked at her. He told you that. He talked to me for 40 minutes. He's methodical, Pietro, intelligent. He genuinely believed this was a calculated risk with a predictable outcome. A pause. He didn't account for the fact that I'm not leverage. I'm a person. He recalibrated midway through our conversation. That's actually unusual. Most people don't. What did he want? He didn't specify. But from the context, The timeline, the resources, the fact that he came himself. It's significant. Territory or protection or both. She tilted her head. What did he propose through the other channels? Pietro was quiet for a moment. A partnership. He controls 3 distribution networks on the south and west sides that run parallel to ours. He wants formal integration, which means access to our infrastructure and our protection umbrella. And you refused because I don't know him. Flat, simple. 14 months ago, Russell Doyle did not exist in my world. Someone who builds a sophisticated operation in 14 months and then introduces himself by taking my pregnant wife is not someone I integrate with. That's rational. Thank you. I said rational, not necessarily correct. She held his look when his eyes sharpened. Pietro. He let me go without conditions. He came himself. He apologized for the conditions, which in his framework probably cost him something in front of his own men. A pause. I'm not saying trust him. I'm saying he's not running on the same logic as your standard rival. He has a code. It's the wrong code, applied badly, but it's there. Pietro looked at her for a long moment. You're giving me a character assessment of the man who kidnapped you. I'm giving you accurate information about an important variable. Those are different things. She met his eyes without apology. You have to meet with him. I know, she blinked. You already decided that. Yes. Then why didn't you? Because I needed to hear how you read him first. A pause. You had 40 minutes and no reason to manage what you told him. That's better intelligence than anything Nico can pull from a database. Diana looked at him. You used me as a source. I married the most perceptive person I've ever met, said Pietro, with the specific neutrality he used when he was saying something true that he was aware might also be inconvenient. That has operational value occasionally. That is either the most calculating thing you've ever said to me, or the most backhanded compliment in the history of this marriage. It can be both. Pietro. Diana. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then, despite everything, despite the warehouse and the hours and the cold fear she had managed down to a clinical frequency for the entirety of the afternoon, she felt the specific, involuntary shift of something loosening in her chest. The thing that happened when she stopped managing everything and let herself register that they were both here, in their bedroom, in their specific and improbable life. You're exhausting, she said. You've told me. I'm going to keep telling you. I know. He reached over and tucked a strand of red hair back from her face with the deliberateness he brought to small gestures when no one was watching. Sleep, Diana. You have to call Doyle. After you sleep. That's not non-negotiable. He said it in Dr. Voss's exact cadence, deliberately, watching her face. Diana pressed her lips together against something that was not quite a smile, and was definitely not going to be acknowledged. I hate you a little right now. I know, said Pietro. Sleep anyway. She did. Pietro didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window of their bedroom, the one Diana called the thinking chair with the specific dry affection she reserved for his habits she had stopped trying to change, and watched Chicago arrange itself in lights against the dark while Diana slept behind him. He could hear her breathing. Steady, deep, the particular rhythm of someone who had spent years training herself to sleep efficiently because residency didn't offer alternatives. She had been out within minutes of lying down, one hand curved under her cheek and the other resting on her belly, and Pietro had stayed on the edge of the bed until her breathing evened completely before moving to the chair. He did his best thinking when she was asleep. There was something about the knowledge that she was safe and present and within reach that cleared the operational static in a way nothing else did. Not silence, not isolation, not the controlled environments he had spent years constructing around himself. He thought about Russell Doyle. 14 months of preparation, 3 distribution networks, a shell company incorporated in Delaware with no traceable ownership. A man who came himself to a warehouse in the South Side, rather than sending intermediaries who apologized for the conditions, who spent 40 minutes talking to Diana, and had, according to the most perceptive reader of people Pietro had ever met. A code. He's not running on the same logic as your standard rival. Diana's assessment. Delivered without editorializing, without the softness that most people applied to information they wanted you to receive a specific way. Just the data, cleanly presented with the clinical precision that had been the first thing Pietro had recognized about her as something genuinely unusual. He trusted her read. He trusted it more than he trusted most things, which was a short list by design. Which meant he was walking into a meeting with a man who had planned for 14 months and executed badly, and still managed to demonstrate, in the execution, enough intelligence to revise his position mid-crisis. That was the part that required the most careful thinking. The meeting was at 9 the following morning, not the warehouse. Pietro had specified neutral ground, a restaurant in River North that opened early for private bookings and whose owner understood certain requirements about privacy and camera placement. The owner had understood these requirements for 11 years. The arrangement worked because it was mutually beneficial, and because Pietro had on one specific occasion 3 years ago solved a problem for the owner that the owner had been unable to solve himself. Most of Pietro's functional relationships had a similar architecture. Doyle arrived 2 minutes early, which Pietro noted. He came with one man, not the 6 from the warehouse, not a show of force. One man positioned at the door, and Doyle himself at the table Pietro had chosen, facing the entrance the way everyone in their world sat, back to the wall, sightlines clear. Pietro sat across from him. Nico stood at a distance that communicated availability without intrusion. For a moment, neither man spoke. It was the specific silence of two people taking accurate measure of each other with the full attention the previous day's events had earned. "Your wife," Doyle said. "How is she?" "She's fine." Pietro's voice was even. "She told you to lead with the actual numbers." Something shifted in Doyle's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a man who had been correctly predicted. "She did. She's right." Pietro settled back in his chair with the particular quality of stillness that people who didn't know him read as relaxation, and people who did know him read as the opposite. "So, actual numbers." Doyle opened a folder, slid it across the table. Pietro didn't look at it, kept his eyes on Doyle. "Talk me through it," he said. A pause. Doyle had expected him to look at the folder. He adjusted, smoothly, quickly, the adjustment of someone who was genuinely intelligent and responded to new information rather than fighting it. 3 distribution networks covering 60% of the South and West Side corridors. Combined monthly volume that your organization currently has no access to because the territories don't overlap. They run parallel. Integration means we stop competing for the same supply chains and start using each other's infrastructure. He kept his voice businesslike, no performance. "My networks get your protection umbrella. Your organization gets access to corridors you currently route around at significant cost. And you get Marcello legitimacy," Pietro said. "Yes?" At least he didn't dress it up. Pietro noted that. "You built this in 14 months. 16. I started before I approached you through the other channels. Who financed the initial build?" A pause. First hesitation. "Private investors. People who are no longer involved." "No longer involved," Pietro repeated. "Correctly." Doyle's voice didn't change. "I don't carry debts I can't control. The investors were bought out 8 months ago. The operation is clean." Pietro looked at him for a long moment. Looked at him with the full, undivided attention that most people found deeply uncomfortable, and that Doyle, to his credit, held without looking away. "Why me?" Pietro said. "Chicago has other families. Older ones. Ones who would have been easier to approach." "Easier to approach doesn't mean better positioned." Doyle leaned forward slightly. "The Marcello family is the only operation in this city that has maintained stability through 3 consecutive leadership transitions and 2 federal investigations without a single structural collapse. Whatever you're doing, the way you run your people, the way you manage external pressure, it works at a level the others don't. A pause. I don't want easier. I want functional. Pietro said nothing. I handled the introduction badly, Doyle said. The directness of it was calibrated but not entirely performed. Diana's read again, surfacing. He has a code. Applied badly. I've operated in environments where leverage was the only language that moved things. I misjudged the correct language for this situation. You used my pregnant wife as a pressure mechanism, Pietro said. The conversational tone didn't change. Let me be precise about what that means in terms of what I'm willing to offer you, going forward. Doyle was quiet. It means this conversation is happening because the alternative, which I am entirely capable of executing, would waste resources and remove a potentially functional arrangement from the board. Pietro's voice remained completely level. It does not mean I've forgotten it. It does not mean there is goodwill in this room. It means I'm a rational actor making a rational calculation, and the calculation currently favors talking. A pause. That margin is not large, Mr. Doyle. I'd recommend not reducing it further. The silence that followed was the specific kind that forms after something true has been said without ornament. Understood, said Doyle. Good. Pietro picked up the folder, read it. Took 3 minutes, which was longer than it needed to be because some of the reading was the document and some of it was the space that silence created, the information that surfaces when you stop filling air. Your South Side network runs through the Halstead corridor. Correct. There's a gap between Halstead and the rail yard, 3 blocks. Who controls it? Doyle's expression shifted fractionally. Currently, no one. It's contested. Contested by 2 independent operators, small, not organized. If we integrate, that gap becomes a problem for both of us. Pietro set the folder down. I'll need that corridor clean before any structural agreement moves forward. That's the first condition. Manageable. Second condition. Pietro looked at him directly. Your people never move in the vicinity of my family again. Not my wife, not the child, not my sister. Not anyone connected to me personally. No change in tone. No added weight. The absence of emphasis was itself the emphasis. This is not a negotiating point. Agreed. Third. Pietro sat forward. I want the names of the private investors you bought out. Doyle went very still. That's non-negotiable. Pietro's voice was the same. Entirely the same, which was the most effective thing about it. If there are people in this city who financed the initial build of an operation that then used my wife as a bargaining chip, I need to know who they are. Not to act on it immediately. To know. A pause. Information I don't have is a liability I don't accept. The longest silence of the morning. Doyle looked at him with the expression of a man running a genuine internal calculation, cost against outcome, risk against functional necessity. Pietro waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the skills that separated the people who lasted in this world from the ones who didn't. The ability to hold silence without filling it, to let the other person's discomfort do the work. I'll need 48 hours, Doyle said finally. Some of those names require careful handling before I can release them. 48 hours. You have my word. Pietro looked at him for a moment. Your word currently has a provisional value, Mr. Doyle. I'd suggest treating the 48 hours as an opportunity to improve it. Doyle absorbed that without visible reaction, which Pietro credited him for. They stood. Brief, functional handshake, the gesture of 2 people who understood the language of the gesture, without investing it with more than it carried. At the door, Doyle stopped. The folder, he said. There's a second section, behind the distribution data. Pietro looked at him. Your wife asked me during our conversation what I actually wanted. Doyle's voice was measured. The distribution networks are what I need. The second section is what I want. I thought it was relevant to include both. A pause. She was right that you respond to specificity. He left. Pietro opened the folder to the second section, read it, stood there for a moment with the paper in his hand and the specific quality of stillness that Nico, watching from across the room, recognized as the signal that something significant had just shifted in Pietro's calculation of an entire situation. Nico crossed the room. "What is it?" Pietro closed the folder. "He doesn't want territory," he said. "He wants legitimacy because he's trying to get out." A pause. "He has a daughter. 19. He's been building an exit for her, a legal one. Clean money, clean name, clean life." Pietro looked at the door Doyle had walked through. "He needs Marcello infrastructure to launder the transition. 2 years, maybe 3. Then he walks away from all of it." Nico was quiet for a moment. "Does that change things?" Pietro thought about Diana. About 40 minutes in a warehouse and a character assessment delivered without editorializing. About he has a code and he recalibrated midway through. "It explains things," he said. "Which is not the same as changing them, but it's useful." He handed Nico the folder. "Get me everything on the daughter." He walked out into the river north morning, called Diana. She answered on the second ring, voice slightly rough with recent sleep, which meant she'd gone back to sleep after he left, which was exactly what he had wanted. "How did it go?" she said. "Complicated." A pause. He could hear her sitting up, the specific sound of sheets adjusting. "Complicated how?" "I'll tell you tonight." A pause. "Go back to sleep." "Pietro." "Diana, not sharp, just final." A longer pause. "Fine," she said. "But tonight you tell me everything." "Tonight I tell you everything. Promise." It wasn't a word he used lightly. She knew that. She had always known that. "Promise," he said. She hung up. Pietro stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the thin Chicago morning light with the phone in his hand. Thought about a man building an exit for his daughter. Thought about a child who would grow up knowing his father had built walls around him before he was even born. Thought about what it cost to protect something. What it actually cost, past the operational calculation, past the strategy and the leverage and the 14 months of careful planning. He understood it. He wouldn't tell Doyle that. But he understood it completely. He walked back to the car. Diana was at her desk when Pietro came home. Not the clinic desk. The one in the study. The small room off the main hallway that she had claimed within the first month of moving into the penthouse with the quiet decisiveness she brought to all territorial decisions. She had rearranged the furniture without asking, added 2 bookshelves, replaced the overhead light with a lamp that produced what she called functional warmth, and Pietro called clinically dim, and installed herself in it so completely that within 3 weeks it had simply become Diana's room in the unspoken geography of their shared space. She was writing notes in that impossible handwriting, feet tucked under her despite the fact that the chair was not designed for it, one hand resting on her belly in the automatic way that had become constant over the last 2 months. Not conscious, just present, the way you kept a hand near something you were responsible for. She looked up when he came in, read him in approximately 4 seconds. He knew she was doing it. He had stopped being unsettled by it around month 3 of their relationship and had arrived, somewhere in the following year, at a point where he found it, privately, in the category of things he would never say directly, something close to a relief. To be read accurately. To not have to construct the version of himself that the rest of the world required. "Sit down," she said, pulling her feet from under her and gesturing to the chair across the desk. The one she used for what Francesca called the sessions that aren't sessions, the conversations Diana had with people she cared about when she had shifted into the careful, present attention that was her default register and also, Pietro had come to understand, the most genuine version of herself. He sat. "Tell me," she said. So he did. He told her about the meeting, the 3 conditions, Doyle's response to each one. He told her about the 48 hours and the provisional word and the functional handshake that carried exactly as much weight as it carried and no more. Then he told her about the second section of the folder. Diana listened without interrupting. It was one of the things he valued most about her. the capacity for actual listening, not the performance of it. Her eyes stayed on him. Her expression tracked the information without editorializing over it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "A daughter," she said. 19. Her name is Mara. She's pre-law at Northwestern. Diana looked at him. "You already had Nico pull the file?" "Yes." "And?" "Clean. No involvement. She appears to have no detailed knowledge of what her father does." A pause. "She's pre-law." The specific emphasis landed. Diana absorbed it. "He wants out for her," she said. Not a question. "That's what the numbers say. The timeline, the structure, the way the exit is built, it's not for him. Men who build exits for themselves don't spend 14 months establishing networks they intend to hand over. They liquidate." Pietro looked at his hands. "He's building something to transfer, something that can be walked away from cleanly. So he does have a code," Diana said quietly. "A functional one, which is not the same as a good one." "No, but it's workable." She tilted her head. "What are you going to do?" Pietro looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to wait 48 hours. If the names arrive, I'll know his word has weight. If they don't, they'll arrive," said Diana. "You're confident." He came himself to a warehouse in the South Side to apologize for the conditions. She held his gaze. "Men who do that follow through on their word. The code doesn't work otherwise." Pietro was quiet. "If the names arrive," he continued, "I'll have Nico run them. If the buyout is clean and the investors are who he says they are, I'll consider the structural proposal." He paused. "Carefully, with conditions that are not currently in that folder." "How many conditions?" "Several." "Pietro." "Diana." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she was deciding how hard to push. He knew the look, had learned its geography over 2 years. There was the version that meant she would push, and the version that meant she had already decided to let it go, and the version that meant she was filing it away to return to at a tactically superior moment. This was the third version. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "That's it? You've thought about it more than I have. You were right about the 48 hours. You're building the conditions carefully." She shrugged slightly. "I trust your read." "You trust my read?" he repeated with the specific quality of someone encountering an unexpected variable. "Don't make it strange." She uncapped her pen and looked back at her notes. "I trusted yours from the hospital hallway too. You stayed until 4 in the morning. That was data." Pietro looked at her for a long moment, at the red hair catching the lamplight she had chosen and he had stopped arguing about, at the hand resting on her belly and the pen moving across the page in handwriting that remained after 2 years, entirely illegible to him. "Diana." "Come here." She looked up, read him again, that 4-second assessment. And what she found in his face made her put the pen down without comment, unfold herself from the chair, and cross the small room. He pulled her in the way he only did when no one was watching. Both arms. The specific pressure of someone who had spent a day making calculated, measured, managed decisions and was done managing. She let him, put one hand against his chest and one at the back of his neck, and was simply there, which was the thing she did better than anyone he had ever known. The capacity to be entirely, weightlessly present without requiring anything from the moment. The baby moved between them. That slow, rolling movement. Pietro pressed his face against her hair. "I don't have the threshold," he said quietly. "Into her hair. Not to anyone. You said it to Doyle, I don't have one. I know. I need you to understand what that means. What I would have." "I know," she said again, softly. "Pietro. I know." He held on. She let him. The names arrived in 36 hours. Nico ran them. They checked out, 3 private investors, 2 of whom had already been repositioned into legitimate holdings, one of whom Pietro made a separate note about for reasons unrelated to Doyle. The buyout documentation was clean. The money trail was traceable and terminated correctly. Pietro called Doyle on the morning of the second day. "The names checked out," he said. "I know they would," said Doyle. "There are additional conditions." Pietro outlined them. 6 specific terms covering oversight, reporting, territorial boundaries, and a review structure at 6 and 12 months. He delivered them without preamble and waited. Doyle asked 2 questions, accepted the rest. "There's one more thing," Pietro said. "Non-structural, personal. Go ahead. Your daughter." A pause. "She stays out of this, permanently. Not by agreement, not by condition. By the simple fact that she is not part of this arrangement and never will be." Pietro's voice was even. "I'm telling you this not as a threat and not as leverage. I'm telling you because I understand what you're building, and I think you deserve to know that the people you're building it with understand it too." The silence on the other end was a different quality than any of the previous ones. "Yes," Doyle said. "Quiet. Understood. Good." Pietro paused. "My wife says you're not what she expected either." A beat. What did she expect? Someone without a code. Another silence. "Tell her thank you," said Doyle. "For the professional courtesy." Pietro looked out the window at Chicago in the winter light. "She'll bill you." A sound on the other end that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. The call ended. Epilogue. Ordinary things. 6 weeks later, Lucas Pietro Marcello arrived at 3:17 in the morning. He arrived, as Diana had somewhat predicted, with maximum dramatic timing and minimum patience for the process, fast, loud, and thoroughly unimpressed with the transition from one world to the next. He had his father's dark honey hair and his mother's green eyes and a temper that the delivery team at Northwestern Memorial would later describe, in the careful language of medical professionals, as vigorous. Francesca, who had been in the waiting room for 4 hours and had sent Pietro 47 text messages during that time, all of which Pietro had read and none of which he had responded to, was the first person allowed in after the initial hour. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at Pietro sitting in the chair beside Diana's bed with the baby against his chest, and her expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that was not quite a smile and was not quite the other thing. She did not say anything immediately. She had learned over 22 years that there were moments that required silence first. Diana was watching Pietro from the bed with the specific expression she wore when she was filing something into the category of permanent information, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, with the careful attention of someone who understood that memory was selective and chose what to keep accordingly. Pietro was looking at the baby. Just looking. With the full, undivided attention he brought to things that mattered. Not the managed, assessed attention of operational awareness, but something quieter and without edges. Something that had no name in the vocabulary he had built for himself over 30 years and that he was not, currently, attempting to name. Lucas made a small sound. Pietro made a smaller one back. Automatic. Entirely unconscious. Diana pressed her lips together. Francesca turned and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of someone managing an emotion they had not been given advance notice of. "He's so small," Francesca said finally, to no one specific. "He's perfectly sized," said Diana. "He looks like Pietro. He has my eyes. He has Pietro's everything else." Francesca looked at her brother. "Pietro?" He looked up. "You have to say something. You've been sitting there silently for 40 minutes and it's starting to worry me." "You've been in this room for 4 minutes, Francesca." It felt like 40. She crossed her arms. "Well?" Pietro looked at her, then at Diana, then back at the small, warm, thoroughly unimpressed weight against his chest. "He's here," Pietro said, simple, flat, the way he said things when the simplest version was the only one that fit. Diana looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He is." Francesca looked between them with the expression of someone who had grown up watching these two people communicate in a language that was mostly silence, and had never entirely adjusted to how much it conveyed. "You're both impossible," she said. "You say that," said Diana, like it's a problem. 3 months later, Diana went back to the clinic. Tuesday morning, first session at 9, the same way she had always done it, with her notepad and her impossible handwriting and the capacity for attention that her patients had come to trust over 2 years of practice. Pietro drove her. He did not offer. He was simply downstairs at 7:40 with the car in the specific expression of someone who had made a decision and was not currently inviting discussion of it. Diana had looked at him for a moment in the elevator, running the familiar cost-benefit analysis. Then she had gotten in the car. They drove through Chicago in the winter morning quiet. Diana looked out the window at the city. Pietro drove with one hand, which he only did when the other was occupied. In this case, holding hers on the center console with the particular grip that said nothing and meant everything. At the clinic entrance, he stopped the car. "I'll pick you up at 6, he said. "I can take a cab." Diana. She looked at him. He looked back. That look, the one she had no clinical vocabulary for, that existed outside every framework she had studied, that she had been cataloging for 2 years and had still not found the accurate terminology for. She had come to the conclusion, somewhere in the previous months, that accurate terminology might not exist for it. That some things resisted clinical framework not because they were vague, but because they were too specific. Specific to 2 particular people in a particular life that could not be generalized into a model. She was at peace with that. It had taken her a while. She was at peace with it now. 6, she said. 6. She squeezed his hand once, brief, unperformative, and got out of the car. At the clinic door, she stopped and turned back. Pietro was watching her from the driver's seat with that same quality of attention. Full, undivided, without edges. She raised an eyebrow. "You're staring." "I know. It's not subtle. I'm aware." "Pietro." "Diana." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked through the clinic door. She was smiling before she reached the reception desk. She didn't tell him that. But she filed it carefully, in the specific category she reserved for things she intended to keep permanently. The look on his face in that car on a Tuesday morning in winter, the hand that held hers without being asked, the man who had overturned a table in a boardroom and driven too fast through Chicago, and sat in a warehouse doorway and called it "picking you up at 6" because he had no other vocabulary for the thing underneath it. She knew what it was. She had known since a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, and a piece of paper with a phone number and a man who stayed until 4 a.m., in a place he had no reason to be. She had just been waiting for the right moment to file it correctly. This, she decided, was close enough.